Chapter 193. The Fount of Light 5. Bastard, do you have no conscience? Who's calling who the devil? Spat Eugene as he raised the holy sword higher. His eyes were fixated on the Fount of Light. Eugene wasn't sure if Sergio knew the truth about the fount, but even the ceremony itself was highly abnormal. Eugene couldn't help but wonder at what age Christina had started being subjected to this cruel ceremony. When had she gotten used to the ritual enough to stop crying? He couldn't help but think back to the girl crying and bleeding. Sergio had put a blade against a girl who was just over 10 years old. He had slowly instilled a saintly personality into her, as if to exterminate any semblance of the actual person that she was. Not a minute ago, this man had ordered his loyal subordinate Atarax to blow himself up as a bomb of divine power. Sergio no longer reacted to Eugene's accusations. Just like the martyrs before him, he had also designated Eugene as the devil. After all, what other word was fitting to describe the existence before him? This devil could no longer be allowed to violate the holy sword. It was a pity, but the holy sword needed to be recovered as quickly as possible, even if it meant killing Eugene. If it was possible to subdue him and stop him from rampaging any further, Sergio could perhaps somehow bring him to the light, but in all honesty, Sergio wasn't confident in overpowering the devil before him. So he had to kill him. Boom. A cross of light emerged from behind Sergio, and he held out his fists in front of his chest as he stood in front of the brilliant halo. It was a common boxing stance. However, it was clear at first glance that he was no ordinary fighter. In particular, the halo behind Sergio was much brighter and more intense, even compared to the sword of judgment summoned by the paladins and the inquisitors. Eugene focused on the cardinal's stigmata. Even in his past life, only a niece had been capable of conducting so much divine power. Although Sergio's divine power was no match for Anice's, Eugene could definitely sense that Sergio was on a completely different level from the other priests. Eugene riled up the ring flame formula in response to the halo. His cores rotated even faster, amplifying his mana. Fwoosh. Flames surged with even greater intensity than before. Applying the empty sword to the aura shield was burdensome. No matter how proficient Eugene was at manipulating mana, the best he could do was to elaborately control and apply multiple coats of mana only on his sword. Therefore, Eugene divided his flames into two, a white-blue flame amplified by the ring flame formula, and a dark blue flame devoured by the black spots formed from condensed, overlapping flickers of the former. The maximum output he could achieve with the ring flame formula still paled in comparison to his peak power from 300 years ago. However, once he condensed and overlapped two layers of the empty sword to form black spots, his sword force was comparable to the power he possessed in his previous life. Obviously, it would be impossible for even high-quality famous blades to contain such dense and violent mana, but the holy sword was no ordinary sword. The holy sword was a useless, redundant wall decoration, but the good part about it was that Eugene's mana would never break the blade. Thus, Eugene raised his sword while focusing on the spots of black spreading along the blade. Double layers. Was it enough? Let's test it. Eugene leaned forward just as Sergio punched. The distance between the two disappeared instantly, and the two fighters collided as if they had been relocated to a different time and space. Not even sound could keep up with their outrageous acceleration. Sergio's fist, which was wrapped in a red cloth, was crushed instantly. The densely packed flames burned away even the blood of the enemy. It was clear that Eugene was by far superior in terms of strength, but although he pushed forward with all he had, he failed to completely sever Sergio's arm as he intended. A bizarre sense of resistance greeted him, and the sword was forced to stop in its tracks. Even more blood dripped down from Sergio's stigmata, and the brilliant halo radiating from his body pushed back on Eugene's sword with enormous force. And that was not all either. Sergio's wounds started recovering at an unbelievable speed, as if he wasn't regenerating but actually rewinding time. His forearm had been cleaved in half straight down the fist, but it quickly reattached itself and his crushed fist reformed. Incredible as it would have been otherwise, it did not come as a surprise to Eugene. The ability of the stigmata etched on Sergio's right arm and the blood that drenched his scar only caused Eugene's blood to boil more and more. The image of Anice bleeding with a bottle of alcohol by her side throbbed in Eugene's mind. Sergio leaned to the side, and the fist wrapped in red immediately rocketed upward. His attack was accompanied by a trail of light that contained the power of the Signum Crucis barrier. Mere contact with the light caused mana to dissipate, and under normal circumstances, it was impossible for a normal opponent to maintain sword force while facing the light. This light would not allow a fair battle to take place. However, Eugene could still keep his mana under control even while fighting against the divine light. No matter how bright Sergio's light was, it could not overshadow the moonlight sword. Since Eugene had practiced his control of mana by using the fragments of the moonlight sword, it was no wonder that Sergio's light could not cause his mana to scatter. On the contrary, thanks to the resistance displayed by Agarotha's ring, Eugene's mana flame only burned with even more vigor and intensity as Sergio's light became brighter. Boom! The flame and the fist collided once more. And again the result was no different from before, and Sergio was pushed backward. Sergio raised his arms as his wounds sealed again. The cross of light shot into the sky and illuminated the dark sky like the morning sun. A chant resonated from the source of light, as if celestial voices were intonating in hymn. Eugene took a few steps back and stared at the sky. 3 angels with unfolded wings were descending to the ground. These were the same angels that Anis had summoned in his previous life. It was impossible to communicate with the angels. They were summoned by the call of a believer, and they performed miracles with the faith offered by the believer. 300 years back, Anis had performed similar feats to seize the battlefield and create miracles where necessary. However, Sergio did not use the angels in a similar fashion. Instead, he leaped at Eugene while leaving behind the 3 descended angels. Simultaneously, the angels joined hands and started praying, causing the light in the sky to beam down on Sergio. The highest level of sacred magic now blessed and protected Sergio. It was a battle blessing, and Sergio accelerated at a pace incomparable to before. His attacks also became heavier accordingly. Although Eugene raised his blade in time, he could no longer push Sergio back. Rather, Eugene was the one forced back as his sword was smashed aside. However, he allowed the flow to take control instead of resisting, then twisted his hips and in one fluid motion, let the sword slash at his foe. The holy sword dug into Sergio's flesh at a speed that left behind afterimages. Boom! A fiery explosion engulfed Sergio. Eugene could see Sergio's body disintegrating, but to his dismay, the high-speed regeneration blessing started to repair Sergio at an equivalent speed. Sergio was at even more of a loss. Even with this degree of protection and blessing, he was still losing in plain old close-quarters combat. Close combat had been Sergio's specialty since his time as an inquisitor. Even the paladins who specialized in battle had never been his opponents. Even after resigning as an inquisitor and stepping up as a cardinal, he had never neglected training. He was a warrior as much as he was a priest. Where he stood now was a result of long years of training and countless battles, and he was even blessed with the highest level of protection from angels. Sergio was ahead of Eugene in terms of physical abilities, yet he was still being forced back. What was it that he was lacking? We see differently. In truth, he already knew, but that knowledge only made it harder for him to accept the fact. If Sergio could see only a few moves ahead, Eugene was calculating dozens. He controlled his movements with eerie precision. He calculated and responded to any and all moves that Sergio made. Sergio let out a long sigh. He stopped momentarily and rolled down his sleeves to hide his stigmata. Eugene responded likewise and stood still, holding onto the holy sword. "Please go back," asked Sergio as a clattering sound approached the two. Christina was staggering along the temple, ruined by the fierce battle. She had a dreamy expression as if she was only half awake and her eyes were dim. "What's going on?" stammered Christina. It was as if she had been drugged and her tongue wasn't quite in tune with her brain. She could not understand what was happening before her eyes. How long had it been? She wasn't sure either. The sky was dark, there was no sun to be seen, but the surroundings were somehow bright. Christina stumbled in her dizziness and leaned against the wall before asking, "What are you doing?" Christina saw 3 angels with stretched wings in Sergio's back. Her stepfather, whom she kept a respectful distance from, was bleeding. She could not see the 2 who had been assisting with the ceremony, Adarix and Giovanni, and the temple was in terrible shape. No, it could not even be called a temple any longer, but rather a ruin. It wasn't hard to understand what had happened after looking around. Christina stared straight ahead, struggling to catch her breath. She saw Eugene holding the holy sword. His indifferent eyes were peering straight at her, and she felt as if her heart was struck when she met his gaze. Christina closed her eyes tight, shuffling backward. "Please return," said Sergio once again. He turned around and glared at Christina with a twisted expression. "What are you doing?" "The ceremony is not over yet. Miss Christina, I've told you so many times how important this ritual is to you as the Saintess candidate, so why have you come out of the fount?" Every word he uttered was like a dagger piercing through Christina's heart. It had been a long time since she had last seen her foster father so angry. The last time was 12 years ago. When Christina had just turned 11, she was blessed with the light and became a Saintess candidate. She first came to this temple, and to her horror, her foster father placed a dagger in her hand with a kind smile. "Cut yourself and enter the fount," he said. Christina had failed to understand his command, mistaking his words for a cruel idea of a joke. However, he had not been joking. When Christina remained frozen, not cutting her wrist as ordered, he simply glared at her without a word. There was no violence, but a silent prayer instead. She remembered his eyes at that time. His eyes had been colder and sharper than the dagger placed in Christina's hand. It had been impossible for an 11-year-old girl to reject the glare. She was afraid of what could happen if she disobeyed. Christina hated the mere thought of returning to the monastery. For her, it had been God's grace for Cardinal Rogerus to take her in. It had been God's grace for her to resemble the face of Anise the Faithful and for her to be illuminated by the light to become the only saintess of the era. Her foster father had explained the ceremony as such. The ritual at the fount allowed her to embody the grace of God. To cut herself with a dagger was to offer her deficient flesh to the light, and once her blood mixed with the water of the fount, holy blood would flow into her body and cultivate her as the saintess. He did not think it was a lie. In fact, Christina's divine power increased exponentially with every ceremony. However, it was only natural for an 11-year-old girl to feel scared to slit herself. It wasn't just once either. She sliced again and again and again, but no matter how many times she slit her wrist, she could not get used to the pain. And despite spilling so much blood, her mind became clearer, and the sense of pain only increased rather than dulling. So she cried. She cried because of her pain and reluctance. She attempted to escape the fount, begging for salvation. However, her foster father always pushed Christina back with his praying hands, showing no mercy and submerging her in the fount. Then his lips parted and he ordered her in a cold voice, "Please go back. Just like now. Miss Christina, you are an apostle chosen by the light, the saintess candidate. You are the second coming of Anise the Faithful from 300 years ago. Only you can succeed Anise and become the true saintess," Sergio said. He was greeted with silence, but he continued. "There has been quite a bit of trouble during this ceremony. However, we cannot allow it to halt the ceremony. We can still resume the ceremony, so please return. Go back, place yourself in the fount, and deliver your flesh and blood." Sergio's deep voice caused Christina's heart to tremble. It restricted her thoughts. The faith he had engraved in her for 13 years acted to bind her thoughts and control her actions. His words were irresistible and her fear was simply fate. The hero Eugene has been corrupted. Although this devil was chosen to become the hero by the light, he refused. So he must be exterminated. "I will bear the burden, so please return and bear the burden of the saintess," he said. Christina opened her mouth only to close it several times. The curse of 13 years weighed heavier on her heart than the words she truly desired to speak. "Christina Rogerus," Eugene called out. Sergio scowled and Christina slowly raised her head. "Don't go," Eugene continued. This time he would say it with certainty. "Just stay there." Christina's eyes quivered. Eugene raised the holy sword to the side as if to show her. "Hero, saintess, what does all that matter? You know me and I know you. That's enough. You dare to even deny the saintess?" Sergio roared angrily. However, Eugene didn't spare him even a single glance. "You don't want to go," said Eugene. "Shut up," shouted Sergio. "Are you worried about the future?" Eugene asked, then raised his sword towards Sergio. "That's a useless worry. If you want, I'll kill that bastard. Actually, it doesn't matter whether you want me to do it or not. Even if you tell me not to, I will still kill him." Christina did not doubt his words. Eugene Lionheart was indeed this kind of man, a man whom she could never consider to be the hero. He had no faith in the light, yet he freely wielded the holy sword. He was a complete non-believer, yet the light radiating from the holy sword in his hand was brilliant and warm. Her foster father had never shown her a similar light, despite rising to the rank of cardinal for his upright faith. His light had always been cold. At every service in the cathedral, her foster father had spoken about the grace and love of the light. He had repeatedly hammered the idea into her as well. However, Christina had never once felt the grace and love of light from her foster father's light. She did not know what it felt like to have a family. Her foster father did not consider her his daughter, only an existence destined to become the saintess. Likewise, Christina did not consider him to be her father either. Ironically, the only semblance of a family she had was the very object of her dread and fear. The resistance she attempted to put up was always weak and insignificant, only crude self-satisfaction. In the end, Christina could not resist her foster father. She had never been allowed to do so, and she had subsequently suffered for 13 years, the prayers and destiny devouring her like a curse. She came to a realization. She was at a crossroads. She cupped her hands in front of her hands without realizing it. Whenever she found it difficult and unbearable, she always prayed like this. She pictured a light in her head, the light that watched over everyone from somewhere in the high sky. She liked the warmth of the morning sun. Ever since she was a child, she favored the sunlight that peered through the window of an empty room over the pillar of light in the great cathedral of Trescia. She felt more comfort and warmth from the light of a small candle than the great brilliance of divine power coming from the fount. "Sir Eugene," she called out. It was the same now. The angels standing behind Sergio, the pillar of light descending from the sky, the cross and the brilliant halo, all were magnificent and imposing. However, more than all of them, the flame Eugene surrounded himself with felt brighter to her. She felt warmth from the white and blue flames. Instead of praying, Christina clutched her chest and forced her voice out with a gasp. "Even if I really am not the saintess, are you truly fine with that?" "Christina!" Sergio roared and turned back towards her. Fierce anger filled him and prevented him from any formalities. You dare! You dare! Are you truly denying your nature?" Anger transformed him into a murderous spirit. The horrifying energy caused Christina to shrink and tremble even more, but she looked straight ahead without turning her eyes. However, she wasn't facing Sergio's gaze. Eugene stood behind Sergio. She stared at Eugene's face in tears. "Sir Eugene," she continued. Sergio took a giant step towards her. "You," she whispered. She had been chosen as the saintess candidate by the light after receiving the name Rogerus. Since then her life had been marked with pain and despair. But she could never figure out why she had to endure this pain to become the saintess. She failed to comprehend why a saintess, the apostle of light, had to cut their own body with a knife in this bizarre ritual. Why was she prohibited from shedding tears of pain, running away or screaming? Why did she have to recite the Bible each day locked in a confession room? Why did she look like Anise the Faithful, and why was she chosen? Why couldn't she express her pain and despair to the merciful God? Why did she have to always display a beautiful smile instead of showing her hatred? Why did the light not shine on her in the darkness? "Will you still save me, even if you are not the hero?" she asked. She did not want to doubt the existence of God. She was worried that she could no longer sustain herself if she started harboring doubts. She had no choice but to think that it was a trial, that God showed her no care to temper her as the saintess. At least that was the only way Christina could convince herself. Although she felt only pain and despair now, one day, she was convinced. Pain and despair always existed in the world. Although the light certainly illuminated the world, it could not save everyone. However, death would lead them to salvation and heaven. Regardless of how plagued and hellish one's life was, one could enter heaven if one lived a good life and served God. She remembered reading the story of the hero. The adventures of the great Vermouth. She indulged in the famous tales of the hero, the one who was also mentioned in the Bible of Light. The hero was the incarnation of light. The hero illuminated the darkness of the world, helped people in despair and saved the world. Christina liked the story. It allowed her to believe that the absence of light in her life was because the hero, the incarnation of light, had not yet been born in this era. When she first received a revelation about the hero, she was overjoyed. The light that failed to bring warmth to her despite her prayers had given her a revelation about the hero's birth. If we die like this, will we go to heaven? Christina knew well that the ritual to become the saintess was terrible. She knew it was abnormal for her to repeatedly do such things to become the saintess. Even if I am not the saintess, will you still save me? She was afraid of everything. She was afraid that the hero Eugene would come to know about the ceremony in the Fount of Light. She was in pain. She felt despair. She was afraid of returning to Trescia, afraid of her forced fate and afraid of her foster father's gaze. The life she led to become the saintess had only been a path of darkness. She was afraid that the hero would not save her. I'm not the hero, said Eugene. Sergio jumped at Christina and reached for her throat, unable to control his anger any longer. He attempted to grab her by the neck and throw her back into the Fount of Light. Eugene Lionheart. The flame penetrated the light. Christina's blonde hair fluttered backward. Accompanying the gust of wind, Eugene stood in front of her and blocked Sergio. The holy sword denied Sergio's extended hand. Is here for Christina Rogerus, not the saintess. Eugene did not look back. I am here to save you. Tears tumbled down Christina's cheeks. Eugene's broad back was obstructing the light. Chapter 194. The Fount of Light 6. Thwack. Sergio's hand was once more split into two. However, there was no blood. Instead, his hand got reattached immediately. There was no pain, but Sergio felt like a nail was being hammered against his chest. He wasn't stupid enough to misunderstand what Christina's words meant. You. How dare you? Shouted Sergio. His eyes were deeply colored with the intent to kill. He could not accept Christina denying her role as the saintess, even more so than the corruption of the hero Eugene. She dared to deny the very nature of her existence, as if she were denying her identity as a human. Get out of my way! Sergio shouted angrily while glaring at Eugene. Naturally, Eugene had no intention of standing aside. He could sense that Christina was quivering and recoiling at each of Sergio's words. However, Christina did not back down. Instead, she attempted to use divine magic as she tried to collect her breath. Even in her state, she was trying to help Eugene. Eugene simply shook his head as he raised the holy sword. With a slight gesture of his hand, he pushed behind him and a gentle force bumped Christina backward. Just make sure to protect yourself, he said. But, Sir Eugene. Christina responded, staring at Eugene with surprise. She wanted to be of assistance whatever it took, but she also knew that her body's inability to move was a response coming from long-acquired fear. Although Eugene made it clear that he did not care about her identity as a saintess, she could not imagine herself as anything else. It was difficult for her to fathom what value she would have without it. So she wanted to help. She wanted to prove that she wasn't useless and could somehow be of use to Eugene. But Eugene shook his head. Don't push yourself. Just stay there and watch. Christina placed her hand against her chest to quench the tingling coming from within as she stared at Eugene's back. As broad as it was, his back was incomparably smaller than the light Sergio produced. However, the all-encompassing brilliant light could not extend its reach beyond Eugene. She squeezed her eyes shut when she saw Eugene's shadow stretch long in the backlight, and when she opened her eyes, Eugene's flame was eroding the light. Boom. The ground gave way under him as Eugene pounced forward, and Sergio extended both his hands with a scream. He intended to stop Eugene in his tracks, but he failed. As a result, he was thrown back with a loud explosion. He glared at Eugene and stretched out his left hand, his crushed body already regenerating. Fwoosh. The red cloth sprang forward from his left arm, which was now limp due to the broken arm bones. Upon reaching Eugene, the red cloth wound around the holy sword. Oh, holy light, cried Sergio. The three angels responded to his call and stretched out their hands. A brilliant light permeated the cloth, quenching the flame of the holy sword. Sir Eugene, take out the moonlight sword. Mare cried out from within the cloak in fright. She knew that the cloth was an artifact with a powerful suppressive ability, and Sergio was unfolding a powerful divine magic of sealing. But no matter how powerful Sergio's seal was, The moonlight sword could easily destroy the entire seal. There was no way Eugene was ignorant of this. However, he chose not to use the moonlight sword. Eugene was well aware that he would receive criticism later on for being stubborn and stupid, but he was adamant. He would use nothing but the holy sword in this battle. That was his resolve. He heard Christina's scream from far behind, and the flame, which had burned bright and intense, was faltering beneath the cloth. Certain that the flame had been completely suppressed, Sergio jumped at Eugene. The stigmata on his right arm was already completely drenched with blood, and the blood oozing from his abdomen was no longer simply dripping. Sergio curled up his bloody hand into a fist, and a brilliant flash manifested into hundreds of swords and surrounded Eugene. "Sir Eugene!" Mare screamed. Eugene quickly scanned his surroundings, but he could not see a path for escape. The holy sword had been subdued by the cloth, and his flames had been sealed. However, Eugene could sense that his flames had not been extinguished. Instead, the sword force formed from the ring flame formula was squirming under the layer of cloth. His lips pursed as he concentrated, and hundreds of sacred swords closed in on him. It appeared to be more than enough force to end Eugene, but even so, Sergio was hesitant in his conviction of victory. The angels sang hymns, and 4 huge hands of light appeared from the sky and the ground. After materializing in this way, the 4 hands followed the barrage of swords and wrapped around Eugene. A faint sound resonated, and although it was pretty soft, Sergio could not ignore it. It was an unthinkable sound, something that should not have been heard. Sergio felt goosebumps rising along with a growing sense of ominous fear. The unexpected stench of death forced Sergio to make a choice. "I will die if I keep moving," Sergio thought, and he knew that he could not dismiss that instinct. As soon as he stopped himself, lightning exploded in all directions. Sparks of flames could also be seen mixed in with the bolts of lightning. Sergio was in complete disbelief as he stared beyond the light and flames. It was not an exaggeration to say that his cloth boasted near absolute power when it came to suppressing and sealing, but it was currently being ripped to shreds. Moreover, the color of the flames spouting through the rips was much darker and more ominous than before. The numerous blades of light had been captured by the flames and were greedily devouring the light. The 4 giant hands of light attempted to seize the entire space surrounding Eugene but failed due to the flames and were scattered as the flame erupted. Blood started to dribble down Eugene's pursed lips, and he utilized the suppressive effect of Sergio's seal to condense the mana that formed his sword force. Then he superimposed another layer of sword force. 3 layers of sword force caused more and more black spots to spread on the blade. Eugene could feel his hand quivering under the pressure of the tremendous energy exuding from the holy sword. He wrapped his left hand around his right to stabilize himself and raised the holy sword over his head. "Ah!" Christina gasped, staring at the holy sword with a dazed expression. Sergio's shoulders started to tremble as he faced the flame head-on. "How far? How far will you go to desecrate the holy sword?" Those hideous flames. It was unbelievable that the incarnation of light was exuding such ominous, sinister flames. The flames were terrible and ugly in Sergio's eyes. How could it not contain even a shred of the warmth and brilliance that the holy sword was supposed to have? Sergio shuddered as he stretched his right arm forward, and the angels took their place behind him with their wings outstretched. Whoosh! A beam of light wove around his bloody arm and formed the shape of a giant bow, and a brilliant arrow was formed from his halo. This was the Bow of Light, a spell that boasted the highest attack power among all divine magic. The beam discharged from the bow would simply ignore magical barriers and aura shields, penetrating through anything in its path. Sergio saw Eugene and Christina lined up in his sight. If he shot at this angle, Christina would be in the arrow's path. Of course, as long as she did not run away. Glaring at Christina, he shouted, "Be cleansed." Rumbly. All the light in the surroundings seemed to converge on the arrow rest. Christina could feel the great power of Sergio's divine spell, but contrary to his expectations, she did not flee in fear. Instead, she ran toward Eugene with a panicked expression, as if to protect him from the vicious attack. Sergio felt intense anger at the sight and immediately loosed off the arrow. Eugene could hear Christina running toward him. It was already too late to reassure her, but there was no need for him to speak anyway. The flood of light accompanying the arrow threatened to burn his eyes, but Eugene kept still and allowed the holy sword to descend. The 3 layers of sword force and the black spots exploded simultaneously. For an instant, the flames that formed the sword force were completely dyed black. The arrow was crushed and the light disappeared without leaving any trace. The resulting explosion washed over Sergio, and the angels wrapped their wings around him to protect him. However, even their wings were charred to nothingness, and the 3 angels perished one after another. Only a thin line of black remained engraved in the air. Christina felt her legs give out before she reached Eugene. It had only taken a moment. For an instant she had seen the light crashing toward her, but in the next, darkness had already prevailed, and Eugene stood alone in the midst of it. However, despite the scene clearly unfolding in front of her very eyes, Christina could not fully understand what had happened. Sergio also failed to understand the situation. He had been swept away by the darkness and half of his body had disappeared without a trace. He was only left with his upper body, thanks to the miracle of the stigmata. The light coming from the scar was protecting Sergio's right arm and his upper body. He could not speak either. Only the sound of air escaped when he opened his mouth. Sergio struggled to raise his head and looked forward where he saw Christina. She was completely fine and without a single wound. But she looked enchanted. He saw how she could not take her eyes off Eugene. Sergio clenched his teeth. Even though she was blessed with that face, the face of Anise the Faithful, she dared to. He turned his eyes and looked down at his right arm. The light of the stigmata was too faint to illuminate the looming darkness. He saw the lightless holy sword in Eugene's hand. He felt despair, but that despair was accompanied by a strong sense of duty. The ceremony was no longer the priority. No, in the first place that thing was no longer a Saintess candidate, so what ceremony could he conduct? He was not sure if he could ever create another candidate with such aptitude, harmony and completeness, but it no longer mattered. There was a crucial flaw in her character and that was the most important factor. The existence of miracles. When Christina was born, Sergio had been convinced that she was a miracle of the light. But it had been a hasty conviction. Just as the hero had gotten himself corrupted, the Saintess candidate had done the same. So he had no choice but to start everything over right from scratch. Kill the fallen hero, retrieve the holy sword and discard the failed Saintess. Once he fulfilled these duties, the light would surely bring him another miracle. They must be purified, he thought. He knew that something horrible would befall the world if he failed to stop the devils and they were given freedom. Sergio had not one shred of a doubt. Holy Spirit. Sergio struggled to move his right arm and eventually placed it on his chest with great effort. Take my spirit and my flesh. His bloody fingers penetrated his chest, and the stigmata on his right arm crawled up his fingers and into his chest. This was the final miracle, a phenomenon that could not be brought forth by simply using the stigmata. Rather, it was a miracle that could only be summoned by devoting one's existence to the stigmata. Sergio knew that he would become a torch of light without any sense of self, but he accepted the martyrdom with boundless joy. A light bloomed in the darkness. The tiny bud of brilliance started to grow in size, and what remained of Sergio's body was enveloped by the stigmata. Once he was fully covered with the stigmata, his body transformed into pure light. It was as if he himself had become the incarnation of light. A stream of light penetrated the darkness, and Eugene felt pain for the first time. He was sure that he had dodged just before the light made contact, but he saw that his left arm was in tatters. It was clear that his arm would have been torn off or completely destroyed if Agarotha's ring had not been protecting him. Eugene clicked his tongue, wrapping the cloak of darkness around him. The beam of light responsible for taking his left arm now stood as a luminous body in human form high in the sky. Its mere presence illuminated the sky as if it were day instead of light. Behold, declared Sergio while looking down at Eugene and Christina. This is the almighty light, the power of God that illuminates the world. You fallen devils will never be able to tarnish this light. Eugene didn't think it was worth feeding his babbles. Instead, he focused on fully grasping Sergio's light. With 3 layers, could Eugene eliminate him in a single strike? Was it sufficient to penetrate the protection of the stigmata? He could not be sure. Sergio's rotten miracle was already beyond understanding as far as common knowledge went. If he applied the same concept of absurdity and used the moonlight sword. Hamel. But there was no point if he used the moonlight sword. He insisted on using just the holy sword. He would not use an ounce of magic and he would not touch any of his other weapons. He had to do that if he wanted to allow the souls of the dead to rest in peace. You're too stubborn. Why do you fight like that? A voice seemed to whisper in his ear. Unlike you, I'm capable of recognizing where I am, said Eugene with a smirk. He took his ragged left hand to his chest. And this is what I have to do now. Eugene's bloody fingers dug into his chest, just as Sergio's had. However, Eugene wasn't praying, relying on faith, or wishing for a miracle. Instead, he was offering himself as tinder for the flames to burn brighter. Dump. Ignition caused his cores to start revolving madly, and Eugene commanded his mana while listening to his beating heart. The rampaging mana left Eugene's control and formed the sixth star, and Eugene laughed as he felt his entire body quake. He had formed the sixth star of the white flame formula, but the situation didn't allow him to observe the resulting changes leisurely. Instead, he directed the rapidly swelling mana on the holy sword. What is this? Thought Sergio. It felt as if the weight of air itself had intensified. Although Sergio was illuminating the sky as the sole source of light, it felt as if he were gradually falling to the ground. No, it was just an illusion, an impossibility. Sergio did not doubt the omnipotence of the spirit permeating his body. The light fell down toward him, and it appeared as if the whole sky was sinking. Eugene could not take his eyes off the phenomenal sight. But strangely, although it was extremely bright, Eugene could see everything with clarity. The light, which was too fast for the naked eye, was now visible to him. No. If anything, the light seemed a little slow. Indeed, ignition activated at the sixth star of the white flame formula was granting Eugene an incredible sense of vision. Ha! Eugene raised his right arm with a dry smile. It's nice to see you. The sword encased in dark blue split the sky. It was not an unfamiliar sight. A formidable force disturbed Sergio's consciousness, but his body wasn't crushed. He wasn't even forced backward. Although it was difficult to believe, the enormous power was under Eugene's strict control. The devastating strike had only erased the light. Thus, only Sergio's body was left in the sky, naked, without any light or power. Naturally, he could not understand what had just taken place. Nevertheless, he saw Eugene kick off the ground. The fast-approaching pair of eyes made Sergio feel enormous fear. He belatedly opened his mouth to scream and attempted to create some distance from Eugene. However, he was prevented from doing so. Violent light was blocking his retreat, even though no sun or divine light was surrounding Sergio. The only source of light was Eugene's flames. Eugene raised the holy sword with a grave expression, but surprisingly, there was no flame coating the blade any longer. What Eugene now held in his hands was simply a beautiful ceremonial sword that appeared impractical. That was all. The blade, which was now devoid of any light, pushed into Sergio's chest. But his heart was pierced and Sergio started to shake. He could only look down at the sword penetrating his chest with disbelief. However, he soon realized that his heart was still beating. He was not dead. A smile dawned on his face with the realization, and he took it as a God-given opportunity. Sergio stretched his arms wide toward Eugene and attempted to call upon the light once more to completely purify Eugene. A small light came into existence. But it did not belong to Sergio. Instead, the light came from the sword penetrating his heart. Ah! Sergio quickly called out to his stigmata, but it did not respond with the same light as before. Instead, the light coming from the holy sword grew stronger and stronger, and Sergio's body disintegrated accordingly. This was impossible. Why was the stigmata? Why was the holy sword emitting such a beautiful, brilliant light in a devil's hands? The light, stuttered Sergio, but no one was there to listen. Eugene twisted out the holy sword from Sergio's chest, and Sergio clasped his chest while staggering backward. He opened and closed his mouth, but no words came out. He looked at Eugene, then looked at his own chest. Christina looked toward the sky with her large eyes. How could? A cliched response. The sword took Sergio's head before he could finish, and the trophy was swallowed up by the light, which quickly spread and devoured Sergio's body as well. Bang! Like the fireworks of a festival, Sergio's body exploded, drawing countless shooting stars across the darkened sky. Leaving behind the downpour of sparks, Eugene slowly dropped to the ground to Christina's side. It was night again. Christina remained sitting on the ground, unable to move an inch. What had happened before her eyes was... No, she could not quite understand what it was yet. Everything still felt like a dream to Christina, but it wasn't a nightmare. "I told you, right?" said Eugene. He approached her while removing his hand from his chest, and Christina took her eyes off the night sky and looked back at him. "I'm here to save you," continued Eugene with a grin. He wasn't fine by any means. His left arm was tattered and he also had a splitting headache. Even his heart was hurting. Till he could move. Ah. Unable to form any words, Christina covered her mouth with her hands and sobbed. The sky was dark. It was an obvious statement. It was night, so it was dark. But Christina felt that the sky was brighter than ever. Christina lowered her head, sobbing. She wanted to do anything but cry, but even that was impossible. The mask she had worn since she was a child seemed to have vaporized into thin air. So Christina cried. She shed tears without trying to hide them and let her emotions take over. She cried with a face no different from when she was a child, making it sound shameful even to herself. She cried so much that even someone like Eugene felt compelled to reach out to her. It was somewhat awkward to just watch, so he tried to wipe away her tears, but Christina suddenly grabbed Eugene's hand. Then, as if she had been waiting, she buried her face in Eugene's chest and bawled. Well, everywhere was hurting. Although he had used it for only a short duration, ignition took a heavy toll on his body. Every time Christina rubbed her face against his chest, it felt as if his muscles were being shredded, his ribs hammered, and his heart punched. However, it wasn't as if he could push her away, not when she was crying so hard. Eugene clenched his teeth to prevent a groan from escaping his lips. For a while, Eugene silently accepted Christina's tears. Chapter 195. The Fount of Light, 7. Ehem. Christina backed away with an awkward cough. Her eyes were swollen and her voice was a little off. Christina stole glances at Eugene's chest, which was damp, while collecting herself. How did you manage to get here? Although the question was quite overdue, it wasn't something that she could hold back from. Christina still wasn't sure how everything had happened. The Fount of Light was a place known only to a select few priests of the Holy Empire. In fact, even Christina did not know exactly where the Fount of Light was located. She only knew that a warp gate was used to travel to and from the fount, and that the warp gate was guarded by the henchmen of Cardinal Rogerus. Miracle, answered Eugene while dusting off his chest. Christina's face turned a brighter shade of red with every stroke of Eugene's hand, and only then did she realize how much and for how long she had been crying on his chest. A miracle, stuttered Christina. But, miracle? She could not help but wonder. Christina did not hate the word miracle. What she had experienced as the Saintess candidate was terrible, but she believed in the existence of God. In fact, her faith in God was the only thing that had allowed her to endure until now. For Christina, a miracle was the work of God. But, I thought, Sir Eugene, you didn't believe in things like miracles, right? She asked. She knew well that Eugene didn't believe in God, and after what he had just experienced, she knew that he would probably never believe for the rest of his life. As such, she felt somewhat puzzled and surprised when Eugene called it a miracle. I might believe in small miracles, muttered Eugene before turning around. He attempted to take a step forward, but, as soon as he shifted one foot, he felt his legs give out under him. The rebound from ignition was here. Christina hurried forward and helped Eugene. Are you all right? She asked. I don't know if I would call myself all right. More than anything else, my left arm hurts, said Eugene. His left arm had been swept away by Sergio's light. The bones were twisted and his flesh crushed. Eugene had no choice but to think it fortunate that his arm had not been completely ripped off. Oh, let me treat it for you, said Christina before getting ready to pray. However, Eugene shook his head and wobbled forward. Where are you going? Asked Christina. The fount, answered Eugene. His answer caused Christina's expression to stiffen. She hesitated for a moment, took a deep breath, then opened her mouth. The fount. What are you going to do about it? She asked. I'm going to destroy it, answered Eugene. He wasn't thinking about anything else. Whatever value the fount had for the Holy Empire of Eurus, it was none of Eugene's business. In the first place, he had killed hundreds of paladins and inquisitors after forcing his way in. He had killed Cardinal Sergio Rogerus, who was second only to the Pope. It would have been strange if only now he started to care about his relationship with Yuras, and above all else, Eugene wanted to rid this world of that terrible fount. No, in fact, getting rid of the fount was not enough. He would destroy what lay beneath the fount, the pipes and everything regarding it. Then he would hold the Pope accountable for everything. I don't know what it is, thought Eugene while glancing at the sword resting in his hand. It felt as if he wasn't the only one who wanted to destroy the fount. Even now, the holy sword Altair pulled Eugene closer to the fount. It had been like that from the beginning. The holy sword had guided him to the source of the fount of light, and when he took Sergio's head at the end, Eugene had not willed the sword to exude light. It had illuminated of its own accord, cut Sergio's head, then devoured and detonated his body with light. It was almost like divine retribution. Is it the god of light? Or mulled Eugene as he arrived in front of the fount. He could feel Minute trembling from the body that supported him. He glanced back at Christina's rigid face. If it's too difficult for you, why don't you wait in the back? No matter how hard it is for me, I can move better than you in your condition, Sir Eugene, answered Christina. She took a short breath, then looked up at Eugene. And, there's no reason for me to back down now of all times, is there? Sir Eugene. How much do you think I've longed to destroy and eliminate this fount? How long do you think I desired this? Wasn't just that either. Christina felt a particular desire rising from deep inside her heart, but it wasn't a desire to destroy the fount. Instead, it was something else. It was hard to explain exactly what she felt and why she felt this way, but Christina knew that she could not back down now. Eugene slowly pushed the holy sword forward. There were many ways to destroy the fount. There was no need for him to use the empty sword. He was sure that he could destroy it by simply bashing it with sword force. However, Eugene did not act upon it. Instead, he focused on the holy sword, which was vibrating subtly. The sword led Eugene forward as it had led him while he was wandering through the fog. He stared at it for a brief moment, then strode forward under its guidance. Plop! He walked into the fount of light, and the quivering of the holy sword grew more intense. On the other hand, Christina had never imagined that she would walk back into the fount, so she froze on the spot when she saw Eugene enter. However, Eugene continued to wade forward to the center of the fount without glancing back. Ugh! Christina clutched her trembling chest and let out a few deep breaths. Then she carefully stretched out her leg to follow Eugene. The moment her bare foot made contact with the fount, all the pain she had felt in the fount until now seemed to return. There were no wounds on her body, she had not cut herself with a knife, and there was no blood either. However, the fount's mere existence was a huge trauma for Christina. The one responsible for forcing her to walk the path of the saintess was dead, but much of her trauma still remained. Christina knew her weakness and fear well. But instead of continuing to hesitate, she took one step after another. She wasn't weak by any means. She knew that if she crumbled or became bound by her terrible memories, everything would stay just as before. She had to face everything directly. She raised her head and looked straight ahead. Eugene was already at the center of the fount, but instead of going any further, he was glancing backward at Christina. The moment Christina met his calm golden eyes, she clasped the hem of her clothes. She didn't want him to see her embarrassing self, even though she knew it didn't matter whether they were the hero, the saintess, or whoever else. However, even without the title of the hero, Eugene Lionheart was a brilliant man. Finally, her heart stopped shaking and she approached Eugene with a placid face. Eugene felt the light of the holy sword grow stronger. Letting the light guide his actions, Eugene turned the holy sword upside down, then struck down at the center of the fount. The surface of the water stirred greatly and the fount started to boil. The divine power dissolved in the water swelled as if attracted to the light of the holy sword. Christina squeezed her eyes shut to avoid the sudden, blinding light, and when she opened her eyes, a little girl stood in front of Eugene and Christina. Christina jumped back when she saw the girl's appearance. "Me?" she said with astonishment. Christina was all too familiar with the face of the little girl. She looked exactly like herself when she was young. "A niece," called out Eugene. He wasn't very surprised. Instead, a bitter smile adorned his face as he called her name. Christina flinched when she heard the name and looked back at Eugene. "Ah." Then she turned back to the little girl. After hearing the name Anise, she did feel that the little girl's face was slightly different from her own past self. However, it really was just slight. The only difference she could see lay in the atmosphere surrounding the girl and her eyes. There were countless statues and portraits of Anise the Faithful in Uras. Naturally, Christina had seen portraits of Anise since she was a child. Like everyone else, she was well aware that she looked like Anise. However, there was a massive difference between feeling a similarity by comparing herself to a painting or a statue and seeing a live, exact replica of herself right in front of her. The girl's lips parted. She patted her cheeks with an expressionless face, then looked around her surroundings. There was a glimmering fountain which she observed. Then she looked up at Eugene and Christina. She immediately noticed that they stood at different eye levels. She continued to caress her cheeks with an expressionless face, then smiled. But when Christina saw the little girl smile, she felt goosebumps running down her back. It was because the little girl's smile was exactly like the smile Christina practiced while looking in the mirror when she was young. The ideal smile of the saintess. However, Eugene couldn't respond in kind with a smile. "You are one nasty woman," said Eugene. The little girl was still smiling. Plop. When the girl took a step, the light surrounding the fount wove around her body. Her appearance changed, or rather she matured. The result was an appearance that Eugene was quite familiar with. Christina was speechless. The mature appearance of Anise made her feel as if she were looking in a mirror. As she continued gawking at Anise, Christina's face quickly turned pale. They looked similar, too similar, and there was no way it was a simple coincidence. Christina felt her legs give out and she covered her mouth, feeling nauseous. Unwanted imaginations forced their way into her mind and disturbed her thoughts. "Please don't," said Anise. She approached Christina while spreading her 8 wings, then continued. "Please don't hate yourself." Anise lowered herself and peered into Christina's eyes. Although Christina didn't think she could cry anymore after pouring out so much before, her eyes were once again filled with tears. The thoughts that pervaded her mind were truly terrible and disgusting. "You are not weak," whispered Anise while taking Christina into her embrace. Christina could not find words to say and instead sobbed once again. The 8 wings slowly descended and wrapped around Christina's body. Then Anise closed her eyes, putting her forehead against Christina's. Christina's ocean blue eyes quivered. She attempted to understand the clear images she saw, but it was simply impossible to accept. Her eyes dimmed as she felt her consciousness drifting away. Anise slowly parted her forehead from Christina's, then closed the girl's eyes. After carefully laying Christina down in the fount, she straightened herself. "Hamel," she called out with the same smile. "I didn't think such an expression would suit you, but it looks quite decent on you, perhaps because you have a different face than before." Eugene raised his hands and touched his face. He could feel creases and grooves as well as his cheeks twitching. He had a warped expression. Eugene forced a smile and shook his head. "What did you do?" he asked. "I made her understand," she answered while looking down at Christina. "This poor child is the same as me," she continued. "What is it?" asked Eugene before giving a long sigh. Then he looked alternatingly at Anise and Christina before continuing. "I saw the source of this damned fount. You must have led me there." "Actually, I didn't want to show you," said Anise, her smile faltering slightly. "Hamel, you must know since you've seen it, but that is not something ordinary people can easily understand." "But we've seen countless terrible things since the past," responded Eugene. "Such had been the world 300 years back. Black wizards ran rampant after selling their souls to demons, conducting all kinds of terrible experiments that completely threw any idea of morals right out the window. There had been several laboratories belonging to black wizards near Helmuth, and most of them were conducting human experiments performed on captured slaves. Eugene had seen many such places in his past life. Naturally, he had wiped them out so thoroughly that they would never be seen again in this world. It was only a matter of course, and Anise had done the same. She had liberated the slaves and healed their wounds. She had burned the black wizards with divine magic and smashed their heads with her mace. But there were always those who could not be saved, those who had been taken too far into experiments. Black wizards were always preoccupied with creating magical creatures or weapons to be used in war, and such experiments robbed humans of their human selves. Some subjects were made into chimeras by combining them with monsters, demons, and other creatures. Some were used as sacrifices to enhance the power of the black wizards. Some were used to create and test new magic. Anise always took it upon herself to embellish their passing. She wrapped with light those who were broken and dying as well as those no longer human and euthanized them. Each time she recited the same prayer with a somber expression. I pray that you see heaven after leaving this world of suffering. The source of the fount, said Eugene with a long sigh, was much more terrible than even the workshops of the black wizards. It wasn't something that the priests of the god of light should have been doing. The filter connected to the pipes contained countless relics. But although they were pompously called holy relics, they were simply bones of the past saintesses. The water of the fount was filtered through the remains and forcibly imbued with divine power, then traveled through the central pipe into the actual fount. It was a necessity, answered Anise in a somber voice. That is how the being called saintess is created after all. Just like this child and every candidate before her and, even me. It was the same with the many saintesses before me. But you and Christina seemed special, commented Eugene. He recalled the vision he saw at the source of the fount. There were countless girls with indistinguishable faces. Their presence had been faint in his vision, but he had seen Anise and Christina with clarity. The same was true even now. Anise definitely existed within this miracle. She stood in front of his eyes as if she had descended from the world tree, and her 8 wings truly were spread wide. Yes. Anise nodded. This child and I are special. We were born with aptitude, harmony, and completeness that could be considered overwhelmingly superior to any of the previous candidates. Aptitude, harmony, and completeness. Eugene did not want to accept such words. You are kind, Hamel, said Anise with a faint smile while gazing at him. And I know that you are not stupid. I'm sure you already have a vague idea of what the two of us really are. Nevertheless, you are staying silent because you want to be considerate, not wanting to offend me in case you guessed wrong. I just don't want to get smacked, replied Eugene while avoiding her gaze. To be honest, I don't really want to know either. I don't want to confirm anything. Whatever the saintess truly is, it doesn't matter to me. You are simply Anise and she is simply Christina. What else is important? Hamel, called out Anise while approaching Eugene. You don't have to turn a blind eye. I know you understand both of us without having to hear the whole truth, but I don't want that kind of sympathy from you. I want you to be yourself, to understand me for what I am. I'm sure that the child thinks the same way. Sympathy? Eugene smiled bitterly. It was an undeniable remark. What are you? So he asked. Just as Anise wanted, he asked directly. You and Christina. No, the saintess, what is it exactly? Why were there such things taking place in this fount? Anise stood in front of Eugene with a faint smile. She explained, a long time ago the god of light first descended on this land. He created the holy sword Altair out of his own blood and flesh and illuminated the world. Then he created a religion and founded Eurus. It was the founding myth of Eurus, the story of the holy emperor responsible for the empire's creation. Anise continued, the ancient incarnation reigned in Eurus for a long time and worked as a beacon in the chaotic era. With him at the forefront, faith was passed on to the world and various gods were born and disappeared. The holy emperor ruled for a long time and protected Eurus and her subjects, but he did not live forever. Since he had descended to the world as an incarnation, he had to return to the sky one day. Anise looked into Eugene's trembling eyes. Once the holy emperor was gone, many members of the church felt fear. They feared that the world would once again sink into darkness in the light's absence. They hoped the light would send forth another incarnation, but such a thing never came true. They had desired light. They desired a new object of worship. Although light is always present, it was too abstract to serve. They needed a more definite, tangible object of worship. They needed an incarnation of light. Ancient Eurus needed many objects and symbols of worship, not just the Pope. Symbols to feed fanaticism. The stigma on the bodies of the Pope and the cardinals portrays how the light was taking care of the world. It shows that the light is directly choosing its surrogates. So many members have come to worship the Pope and the cardinals like gods. And the saintess? A symbol of worship just like the Pope and the cardinals, said Anise with a twisted smile. She continued. The first saintess was an artificial imitation of the incarnation of light created using the remains of the Holy Emperor. A sacred weapon capable of bringing down miracles, created by embedding the remains of the holy emperor in the body of a young girl, an idol made for worship. And thus, the ancient fanatics had come to make a new light in their own image.